away with dull care. The day is set fair, a while is set near, to bring us good cheer. In winter time or summertime, or leisure time and pleasure time, the daily times at Big Ben chimes are radio time.
Good evening, my name is Tim Wander. I'm the consultant curator for Sandford Mill and Chelmsford City Museum Services. I look after Sandford Mill and the Marconi and other collections, and of course behind me the 2MT Writtle Hut, the pride of place, especially tonight, the 95th anniversary of 2MT, the most famous railway station in the world. I mean, in this modern age, we've moved so quickly and technology has moved so fast that we've lost some of our history and our roots. But Marconi was one of the most important people, and from his company came radar and television and computers and even the internet, and of course radio in all its forms and guises. We're now talking to spaceships as they leave the solar system. Marconi would have been amazed, but perhaps not surprised. But tonight, what we're doing on St Valentine's Day night, when we perhaps should be doing other things, but tonight we're at Sandford Mill. We're standing outside the 2MT Writtle Hut. So this is an original 1916 Royal Flying Corps hut installed on Lawford Lane, then called Lowford Lane, to house airmen to shoot down Zeppelins. It was there for 2-3 years. The Marconi company took it over in 1919, and they installed the Marconi Airborne Wireless Telephony Research Group, a distinguished bunch of 6 or 8 engineers, depending on who was there, and their aim was to develop what they had designed while they were in the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War. They were really looking to equip the first civilian airliners. So really you have to look at the world of 1919. The war to end all wars was over. The troops came marching home, those who survived the horrors of the trench and mechanised warfare. Over 1 million men had been trained in who had been exposed to the use of radio. But alongside there was a new industry of civilian aviation. You can now fly around Europe in complete luxury. Essentially the aeroplanes had wicker basket seats, table, fine dining, waiters in top hat and tails, and the aircraft were flying across Europe, but they needed a new technology to make it safe. They needed navigation systems based on the World War I direction finding systems designed by Round and the Marconi Company. They needed airborne radio systems. They had to talk to the new international airport at Croydon and the soon-to-be little airport at a place called Heathrow. Whatever happened to that place, let's be honest. All the equipment was designed, developed, including the Croydon Air Traffic Control System and Control Tower radio, by the engineers, the young engineers in this hut, sitting in this lonely, partly flooded field at the edge of Writtle. They had no mains electricity. There was an Austin A35 generator and an end hut here running away. They didn't even have a working toilet. They had a horn speaker in the hedgerow. But luckily at lunch they went up to the Cock and Bell pub for a libation. And out of this environment, this is where radio was born. You have this incredible hotbed, this almost volcano of brilliant young men, all who've survived the First World War, all of whom now are entering the roaring 20s, who are basically looking to the future. They are at the cutting edge of technology, the new industries. And suddenly in 1922, the Marconi company came to them and said, do this thing called broadcasting. What? What the hell is broadcasting? We don't know what broadcasting is. There are no rule books, there are no manuals. And of course, being Marconi's, being the 1920s, they were told there was no extra money. Everything they did had to be done in their own time for no pay. Even the equipment had to be returned to normal use the next morning after the broadcast. So how do you do this thing called radio broadcasting? It's not established, there's no one known. In fact, the very science of transmitting speech over the radio is less than 4 or 5 years old. So these engineers sat down in the Cock and Bell and put together the idea of the first broadcasting station. This was going to be advertised. It was going to be every Tuesday night. They thought around 7 or 7:30 to allow people to get home from work. And they would transmit gramophone records and maybe some news, and there was no other ideas from that. The first night, 95 years ago from where we stand tonight, St Valentine's Day, it was actually not really cold and crusty, it was a nice evening. They had the piano pushed down the lane from the community hall in Writtle, all the way down, bumping and grinding. Who knows what it sounded like? The original piano still survives in the hut. And the stall, it was there. It was part of the first concerts 95 years ago. And at first they stood at the microphone, they played, we're going to hear a record entitled, and as Eckersley said, why are records always entitled? Why aren't they just called something? But you started to get the inklings. And then Peter Eckersley came to the microphone. Now, Peter Eckersley had two sides. On one side, he was one of the best aeronautical radio engineers in the world. He'd forgotten more about radio than anybody else around. On the other hand, he was a natural comic, raconteur, humorist, impressionist. He had a unique ability that was probably not seen for another 30 years, where he could literally walk to the microphone and talk to his listeners all over Europe as if they were in the room with him and as if they were his friends. And Eckersley's warm voice, his mellow tones and his irreverent sense of humour throughout the summer of 1922 changed the world.
Who would you compare him to? Kenny Everett of his day, or
No,
too irreverent?
No, I don't think so. I mean, he was a maverick. He was born when Victoria was alive, so it was a very formal world in 1922, or just changing as the Roaring Twenties. I've always called him the fifth member of the Goons.
Hello CQ, hello CQ. This is 2Emma Talk, Writtle testing. This is 2Emma Talk, Writtle testing. Hello CQ, hello. Hello Ash, hello Ash. Ash, hello. Are the signals okay? No, they're not. Wave your hand if it's all okay. No waves? No waves at all. Curse. Kirk, is that all right in there? Kirk! No? Not? Sorry. Well, sorry,
That's right.
CQ. Closing down a moment. Hello, CQ.
300
Hello,
sheets
CQ.
of
This is
paper.
2Emma Talk, Writtle testing. This is 2Emma Talk, Writtle testing.
However, in 1922, when Eckersley stood to the microphone, three of the Goons were still in nappies and one hadn't been born yet. Yet, what Eckersley did with his humour, his very risque jokes, the first time everybody heard it. Imagine sitting in Newcastle or Aberdeen or Scotland or Cornwall or even the south of France with earphones clamped to your head, a crystal set, tickling the crystal, a wire hanging down the garden, and suddenly Peter Eckersley came through and you're hearing jokes, skits, impersonations, the first children's hour, the first radio play, the first fan club, the first competition. He wrote the whole rule book and everything he did was new. It was the first. Some things didn't work. Peter Eckersley couldn't sing, yet he liked to sing. He had the first sound effect studios. We all think now of coconuts. He was the first. Ginger beer bottles hanging from the beam broken. Drill a hole in a record off centre. Some of the listeners might know what a record is, but play it at the wrong speed, drilled off centre, and then pour marmalade on it and see what it sounds like. Peter Eckersley, 1922 from the Hut. Because it was interesting and his listeners loved him. Within 3 or 4 months, he had an estimated 15,000 listeners from nothing, the first British broadcasting station to be heard across Europe. So I think you're getting to a point now whereby they'd realised by September that this was amazing. This was really amazing, that the world was changing. The British Broadcasting Corporation, which was then a company, was brought into place because they were terrified of what was going to happen next. As Writtle took to the airwaves and was such a success, 60 companies applied to have their own radio stations. They wanted their own radio station. In fact, 2ZY in Manchester was operated by Metropolitan Vickers, actually illegally. But Writtle was a legal advertised station. They realised that something had to give, so in November 1922 they formed the BBC under John Reith, a very staunch, very strict ex-Presbyterian minister and a First World War veteran. He knew nothing about radio. He was a businessman, not an overly successful one if the truth be known, but what he did have is he had an eye for people. In January 1923, as the only employee of the BBC, he sat in his office under the stairs in Magnet House, picked up the phone and rang Peter Eckersley, who was still a top radio engineer here, but every Tuesday night just had a great time on the radio with his friends. As Eckersley said in his own words in his fantastic book, The Power Behind the Microphone, with an hour of meeting Reith, not only did he agree to shut 2MT at Writtle down, he'd also agreed to become the first engineer at the BBC. He hadn't even told his wife that he was going to leave Marconi's. And then basically what happened was he became the chief engineer at the BBC because he was the only engineer. However, Eckersley was no fool. He picked up the phone and hired 7 of the 8 engineers that were left at Writtle, who then became the director of research, the director of engineering. You're getting a theme. What they did over the next 7 years was they built the BBC from 5 or 6 men in a hut to 5 or 6 men in an attic in Marconi House in the Strand to the largest broadcasting corporation in the world. By 1928 they had over 900 engineers, 20 stations, 28 relay stations, and 98% of the population can hear radio on not just 2 channels but 3 with the long wave that Eckersley pioneered. And even more, some of the Writtle team, when Eckersley left, as Ashbridge became chief engineer, went on to pioneer television. The early television trials with John Logie Baird and the EMI Marconi system were all run by Kirk, who was a Marconi 2MT veteran. They then went on to do VHF radio. And of course, out of those television trials, a very important thing happened: radar. So you may wonder why hundreds of engineers were busy working on television through the late 1930s, because when war broke out, television is actually radar in just another guise. And suddenly we were ready with the chain home system. All came out of the engineers. And in fact, the Writtle team through the Second World War were lead engineers in the BBC to defend the country. So I think you're getting a view now that from this small hut behind us, a little bit moth-worn, as she is 100 years old. It was our anniversary last year, restored by veterans, and for nearly 20 years she sat as the sports hall for the King's Road Junior School in Chelmsford. Dismantled, put into council store, and then restored by the veterans. It is now essentially hallowed ground. This is where British broadcasting began, and as such we're extremely lucky and privileged to be able to use it and to be able to transmit from it. And as you probably gather, I love the place.
You must be in absolute paradise here on this night.
It's a nice night, and essentially I think the other thing to bear in mind is that this is 95 years. It's a slightly strange anniversary, but myself and Jim Salmon, who's looking after Emma Talk, and please look at emmatalkradio.com and tune in, we decided that now was a good time to bring it to the fore, because we're now planning the centenaries. We are only 2.5 years away from celebrating the first Marconi experiments with broadcast speech from the New Street Works in 1920. So in June 1920, Dame Nellie Melba, their great big large Australian soprano, sang her heart out as a paid experiment by the Daily Mail and changed the world. Lawrence Melchior, a famous Danish tenor, came a month later. Now, they were experiments, they were not advertised, they were private, and they had all kinds of technical issues, including every radio station in the south of England couldn't operate when Chelmsford had a musical soiree, which caused a few problems with the New Croydon air traffic control system I mentioned, and the aeroplanes couldn't find their handing. So when they came to Writtle in 1922, this is where the world changed, and for a moment in time this was, in my mind, the most important place on the planet, because this is where it all began. Everything I said started here, just because Peter Eckersley and 5 young men who'd survived the First World War had the sheer joie de vivre, the sheer ebullience, and the sheer, I don't know, courage, arrogance, not knowing any better, to stand in a partly flooded field and call CQ. This is 2 Talk Writtle testing, 2 Talk Writtle calling.
For further details, visit our website at www.emmatalk.com.
from Radio Emma Talk.